Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 55th audio chat on the Q News Patriot Rumble Channel series. I am the Q News Patriot, joined today by Patriot and researcher and self-described ordinary guy American, Judah Ayers. My name is SG Anon. Judah has an interesting story and some tremendous research into an issue surrounding a company and an economic model that many Americans are very familiar with, certainly at this point, post Y2K. We saw in the, I think, 80s and 90s an explosion of what was initially marketed as a home-based business alternative, more formally called MLM. Amway is one of the best and most recognized groups with regards to that business model, essentially pioneering its large scale rollout here in the United States. But as we have often found in this journey, all is not as it seems. Judah has tremendous information, I think, and a large amount of again hours into this research that I think will help paint a picture for patriots out there who are trying to connect the dots between the incestuous relationships of privatized corporate entities, large-scale government pulpits of power, and this movement forward in a very evil, very sadistic way that seems to have been marching us down sort of an unstoppable path in the Western world for at least the last half century. Judah, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's an honor, SG, and your work is fabulous. And thank you for all the patriots that are stepping out and really uh, allowing people to be able to see what I call behind the curtain. You know, we talk about the Wizard of Oz, and what people don't know is what's happening behind the curtain. And so people are getting a peek behind that. And when Trump says we caught them all, he's not saying that understated. And so, yeah, it's been an honor. And you know what? We do this for our future and our kids' future. But for the public to be aware and to be known about who has been stealing our constitutional rights and what they've been planning behind the curtain for a period of time, it's very important because it's almost unbelievable until you actually look at the facts, you line things up, and then logically you can connect the dots. They talk about a lot of things that they've done, and really, in the occult, they do a lot of things which is hidden in plain sight. But once you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, it's not hidden anymore. It's clear as day to those people who are awakening in this great movement.
Indeed, it is. And I'm hoping our discussion today is going to provide some much needed clarity for individuals out there, really from a whole host of different dimensions. When you and I first connected on this issue, I initially thought that what you had unearthed with regards to this particular, organization and their corporate model was primarily based in fraud. And while that is true, and I think we've discussed a little bit of that, it goes much, much deeper, and they're actually much more closely engaged with what we would call that next level corruption, that multi-state, multinational corruption matrix that has essentially subverted control of governments, certainly in the Western world, certainly over the last 30 to 50 years here in the United States of America. But for my audience out there who's just getting a chance to come and meet you for the first time, do you care to give us a background a little bit, how you came to know this organization called Amway and why you're now at this point in this journey engaged in the patriotic battle that you are?
Yeah, it's a good question, SG. And to be honest with you, I never thought I'd see myself in this situation. But you know what? It's that moment in history where you know what you ask of the Father, you ask God, "Hey, what am I supposed to do?" And He tells you to move forward. Guess what? The only thing you can do is be obedient. But from my perspective, I spent 22 years in this ecosystem, and as I got out of college, I did what everyone was supposed to do, what they told us to do to be successful. Went to college, did that, went to the great state of Michigan, Michigan State University, studied business and engineering up there, got my job, and started moving on with my life. When I saw the Amway business, my father was an executive at Ford Motor Company. And over the years, I saw he was very successful doing what he was doing. And he actually invited me out to a business meeting, and I saw the business per se from him. But over the years, I got involved in the business. He was successful doing what he was doing. I started being successful in what we were doing. And we thought we were doing what they call the American way. And as we were moving forward with our business, we started identifying things that just didn't add up or didn't make sense. And lo and behold, as I saw the business growing, I was excited about that because I was participating in what they call free enterprise, something that was supposed to allow us to be able to control our time and money and then be able to give back to our communities. But lo and behold, I had no idea at the time where the profits of this organization were actually going. And over time, I tell people all the time, there's good ways of making money, and then there's bad ways. Over time, you're going to be confronted with something that is called truth. At some point, if you work on someone's mental capabilities of speaking and learning, you can actually intercede the way people think. There's actually programs out there called MK Ultra, which are then what are called a group think, controlled thinking. And then ultimately, people, in my perspective, have been put in a system to where they have now given over their rights of thinking to a group. Amway is very good at this concept. And these people no longer, a lot of them can no longer think for themselves because they're so focused on greed or money, a goal. But the way the rails of communication work throughout the system, they've created a system to where they won't identify negative. Negative is a topic that immediately gets denounced because of the rules that are implemented by their system. They have things that are called the three nevers, the cardinal rules, and the 19 player steps. And every single one of these things have built in a back end to hide things that are not right. And if you take these things up to what they call an upline, they immediately get squashed. And that person is immediately in the upline. A lot of these people know these topics that are going on behind the scenes, and they are denounced. And as they move on with their agenda, some of these people know exactly what they're doing. Now, the masses of the people, in the leadership categories, they have a very keen sense and a very clear understanding of what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish because they are in partnership with the United Nations. And what people have to understand about the United Nations goals is that they are not for a republic. They are not for America. And so what we're finding here is we're finding people that are set out on a mission that is never going to reach its goal. And that is to help create wealthy entrepreneurs and business owners. The business is broken per se, but what's happened is that they've identified, since it's not necessarily working that great here in the United States, is that people can take their mind and their sound capabilities to try to go into other countries and then try to repeat this process in foreign countries. And that's part of the carrot of some people saying, hey, they want a big business. But what we've identified is that the funds of everything within the Amway business, based upon what I've done, my 22 years of experience, is not only smoke and mirrors, it's pure deception. And that deception is not benefiting mankind. And so I kind of share that a little bit tongue in cheek because that is 22 years of experience when I've tried to bring things that should, at any board level, they should take responsibility to identify these problems. And what happens is they've clearly identified these topics and clearly ignored them. And when you ignore things that are for the people, watch out because the people eventually will come back and say, hey, justice needs to be served. And that's what we're starting to find out is throughout this great movement is that the people, God's people, have been starting to move to identify places of justice. And this is extremely one of them.
I'm absolutely fascinated. I'm excited to break it down for the audience here, but I want to start at a very high level, a very surface level. Amway is essentially one of these organizations that is known the world over as a trendsetter, as a pioneer, late 80s creation, I think, or early 80s creation, excuse me, and then accelerating up towards Y2K. Everybody sort of, wanted to keep up with the Joneses, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, this is a little bit before my time, but going off of the things that I've read and heard and spoken with, this was very much, the in thing to do. And yet it has absolutely, I think, desecrated from a reputational status the revenue sharing model that Amway, I think, functioned to bring to that public fore in the largest way. That being said, as we reflect back on things from 2024, Um, I think we have a pretty demonstrable history of an organization that's not interested in the success of its people primarily. It's interested in the success of its mission, of its agenda. But we also have an organization that has engaged in again, that next level corruption. I think that really calls for a much closer lens and a much closer magnifying glass. So starting off with the business side and leading towards more of the salacious things, what in your research have you found that Amway has been engaged in, which is antithetical to we the people?
Gosh, that's a great question, SG. And really, I tell people all the time is that there was a post board out there at one time with a specific number and letter. But one of the posts it says is that sometimes you can't tell the public the truth, but you must show them the truth. It's time to wake up. And what we mean by that is the business is one thing to create and send dollars and cents to create commerce. There is something that we have in the United States, which is a group a council that's supposed to be for America. But that group or council of business owners, as they come together, they actually have a secret organization that a lot of people aren't aware of. And that council, in terms of what they're putting stuff together, is very unique. And some people were elected to that board. And that board, as they identify in terms of what they're doing, they have certain agreements. And when you start talking about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the on their own website, to be a member of it, you have to be part of an organization called the Freemasons. This organization is now representing all the CEOs of most of the Fortune 500 companies across the United States. Years ago, I started to come to notice that Jay Van Andel and then ultimately Steve Van Andel, of the latest, was the chairman of the entire board of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As we look into that, one of the interesting topics is I've learned from you and from other people is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, DC has numbers to everything. There's actually a group that they identify things by the numbers. The address 1615, actually, if you add that up, it equals 13. People want to talk about conspiracy theories. Well, conspiracy theories end at conspiracy truth. The conspiracy realist realizes, well, what does that 13 mean? Well, we got to go back to these 13 bloodline families and what they're trying to conspire or organize worldwide to bring together. And so we say commerce. I wanted to build the business because I wanted to do things for my own family. I wanted to make profit. I wanted to do good things. However, I was not interested in taking the funds that I made from my business and then contributing those things to paying off political candidates. We started to realize, and I noticed this after January 6th, Betsy DeVos was actually elected to be part of the U.S. Secretary of Education. When that happened, I was kind of like, wow, taken back. I wanted to watch and see what she was going to accomplish by being put in that position. What I started to notice was she wasn't doing anything. And I was watching this position very closely because Donald Trump made some clear statements of what he wanted to accomplish in terms of taking back and saving the children. Well, that position, as you watch it very keenly, nothing really seemed to happen. But on January the 7th, after the biggest thing to happen in the United States of America's history, she resigned from office, from Donald Trump's office. And I started to add these things up, and I wanted to know why. And then I started really digging in, and I wanted to know why was Amway taking my funds, IBO funds, the Fields funds, and funding not only her, but many, many other candidates like Mitch McConnell or John McCain or Mitt Romney or many, many, many others. Matter of fact, there was well over 17 that were very key in terms of putting Donald Trump up for impeachment. And as you go in to look at these numbers, there's what's called the RDC, which is an Amway fund that was giving money back to these groups in other places. I started to see these things. I started really just connecting all the dots. And I realized that the entire Amway field did not have the same agenda with their profits of their funds or their purpose of building a business that the corporation did, or really the families. Ultimately, when I started going back and peeling back this onion, I asked this question, and this is what really got me, I think, terminated. But within the Amway business, I saw people that were making what they call diamonds. They were false legs, selling profits into false organizations, creating fake pins. Well, that was one of my questions. Well, in doing so, that was fraud. And I said, well, I don't want to build a business improperly. And so I went to my upline organization, my upline partner and mentor, who was the head of the entire Amway business in terms of the IBO chairman. And I asked this gentleman, Joe, I said, hey, there's some fraud happening in our business, even with my upline in certain organizations. And I was told that my breath stinks. And I was like, wow, that's a very interesting topic. And I started noticing that we had conferences and other business organizations, things that we do are called LOA, system tools and functions and conferences. And I had certain people in my group and other groups, we noticed that they were selling tickets to fake business owners, people that didn't even exist. And these uplines would not call them out on this fraud. Well, one of my other business partners, he happened to be at the IBO board, the head of legal and ethics. And so I asked him this question. I said, well, hey, if you're the head of legal and ethics, wouldn't it be considered fraudulent for us to be able to sell people into an organization to collect profits that are not real people? And he kind of caught him off wind, and he decided, hey, well, I'm going to stop talking to this gentleman. Well, from the business side of it, I wanted to know why they were transferring false volume and collecting false sales. Well, ultimately, this goes into other countries. There's a lot of things that happen in that point, but the basis was that that bothered me. Then I went into the topics of the political topics with them, and I wanted to know why they were funding or trying to fund Mike Pence for $90 million, which they did, along with a collective oligarchy of other people in the Michigan area that necessarily weren't for an America First agenda. They were for a United Nations First agenda. And so as I brought these topics to them, immediately I was sent a cease and desist order. And then I was terminated from my business via kangaroo court. And I wanted to know why they terminated me for, we have a contract that says, hey, you're supposed to follow these rules and regulations in terms of terminating me. And they didn't even give me a voice to be able to speak for myself. Well, immediately when I asked these questions and that occurred, I realized something was majorly wrong. And so what I did is I wrote a letter to them and I copied President Donald J. Trump. I also copied another gentleman by the name of General Flynn. And then through that, over a period of time, I copied a lot of congressmen and a lot of senators. And here's what I found. I found the recipe. The recipe is that was who got back to me and who didn't. And so, anyways, long story short is when you see these things, you see corruption, what are you going to do? And so I identified this because I did not want to see my country fall to foreign agents who were impacting our elections through different processes. And so that's just a little bit of the aspect of how I take from the business side to the political donations and realize that the people that are building the business, they don't agree with these things that they're doing.
And isn't it also true if I can add context to this, we're talking about the business fraud, the essentially the gigantic levels of washing of funds, which is unsurprising in any deep state money hole, any deep state hidey hole. But with regards to Amway in particular, isn't it also true that the founding family of Amway, the DeVos family or the DeVos family, are heavily engaged in, or I shouldn't say heavily engaged, but have been heavily involved in the Gerald Ford Foundation. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so we go back to these types of things. I had literally when this happened, my 20 years of experience. Before me, my father had about another 20 years of experience. So there's collectively about 40 years of experience within the Amway business. And we used to pride ourselves all the time because we go to these conferences and they would always have, at the time, George Bush or somebody connected to the Bush dynasty come in and speak to us. And we thought that meant business. We thought that was a good thing. We thought these things were pure, right, and just. And over the years, we started to realize that 9/11 happened. That was the first doorway of opening my eyes to a lot of things that were happening, connecting the Amway business. Matter of fact, we went to a conference. It was a Q12 celebration conference, and the guest speaker happened to be Colin Powell. That was the first really eye opener for myself to think, what in the world? Because I knew behind the scenes what Colin Powell was involved with. I had no idea he'd be involved with the Amway business. And so my radar went off. Holy Spirit was like, hey, this guy is not a good guy. And anyways, lo and behold, I asked the question in the beginning of then is like, why is Colin Powell speaking for Amway? And he was promoting the business like he was an IBO. So that radar went off. And originally I realized Colin Powell's relationship with the Bidens and some of these other people, I had mentioned that to my upline at the time, and they would say, oh, that's just, those are just pictures. Don't worry about those types of things. We'll take care of it. We're concerned about your freedom. We're concerned about your business and you making a profit. Don't worry, we'll handle that type of stuff for you. And I was like, wow, okay. So then I went back to the mundane groupthink of just building my own business. Well, again, as we go back to this, I started doing my research and I laid out the logistics and the dots connected to the Amway property. I started to realize that on the property there was a building built. Ford Foundation, built on Amway property by Amway profits with the DeVos family and the Van Andel families. And I started to realize that board, if you look at the board, Mr. Powell was actually on that board. And I was like, wow, that's not a good thing. And I started realizing before this that the Cheneys were on that list. I started realizing that Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, both were on that list. There was actually Alan Greenspan was on that list. There was a lot of people on this list that were considered not good people. Well, I kind of curbed that a little bit, and I started realizing that this foundation had a little bit deeper topics to it. You know, the Gerald Ford Foundation, if you go back to it, has always had their hand involved in the vaccine agenda. The COVID topics are very well connected back to this organization. If you actually go back to the 1970s, Amway was rolling and steaming really big at the time. Every household was growing in this business, contributing money that went back to really the DeVosses, which fueled the Ford family. And the connections kept growing from this group. I'd say part of these groups, a lot of the people from the senior executive service were a part of this group. And as you start to see the Ford Foundation in terms of what they've done, it's very unique. Their hands are connected well within the United Nations. And so you start to see this topic of human mapping, human genome. It's almost like they have two sides. You have the DeVos side, which is the political arm, and then you have the Van Andel side, which is the biomedical arm. And so both of these arms are being coordinated through the Gerald Ford Foundation. And if someone goes and sees the board members and trustees of the Gerald Ford Foundation, you'll find that there's many, many, many connections within that organization to things that are very devious. And I'll leave it at that. You're very well versed in those topics, so I'll let you talk on that.
Well, it just adds, I think, tremendous substance to the conversation when we start to appreciate that there has been a long history of, what we would call pseudo-private involvement with the government pulpit of power and the government financial sector as well. But really, it's not a private operation. It's an extension of. It's the difference between true laissez-faire free market and a manipulated facade, which is what we've all been, essentially living under and doing business under for a very, very long time, predating even the First World War. But I want to switch over to, just for a moment. You mentioned something very interesting about Van Andel, and if I'm not mistaken, the Van Andel Institute is heavily connected to Amway as well. Do you care to delve a little bit into the findings that you have surrounding Van Andel and Amway's involvement with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. When you look into the Van Andels, we've got to talk about the topic of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was put on all the walls throughout the Ford Foundation. If you take a tour, matter of fact, if you go into the Amway Corporation too, you also see honorariums to Henry Kissinger. You'll see these things that they're well throughout, which connect into the Van Andel Institute. Van Andel Institute, over the years, to us as IBOs, was considered the place where they did nutritional data. They would do homework and do studies to tell the business owners, hey, your products are very good. They're backed up by these scientists. They're backed up by these people. Well, one of the questions I also had was, why was Dr. Francis Collins, people should look into that name, the Collins family, and the history behind the Collins family. And that was, he was the head doctor who got the Van Andel Institute up and running, and progressed through there to where at the time Obama was appointed, he took the position from the Van Andel Institute to become the new NIH director, which Fauci reported to. And so once you start really tearing back these levels, you start to understand who built the Van Andel Institute. Well, the Amway business owners, that money is what funded the Van Andel Institute. What is their main statement and mission statement? I tell everyone to go out to their website. As you log into their website, there is a DNA structure, which is in their main lobby. Their main lobby, in terms of what their main foundation and structures of the Van Andel Institute is, DNA mapping, of mapping the human genome. And ultimately, as we start to understand this New World Order topic and the control of one's DNA, these are the things that they've been working on behind the scenes for a very long time. Matter of fact, in partnership also with Harvard University. So, as they partnered with Harvard University, Dr. Lieber was one of the connections to the Wuhan lab in China. All of this working through Dr. Fauci, his partnerships, and Dr. Collins. And so as you break these things down in these partnerships, I tell people all the time, or a certain organization would tell us, is follow the money. And so that was just one of the things that we want to say is follow the money. But as we look at these DNA mappings, these are what they're looking to do to be able to control the body. And so, again, it's very interesting that this is located on the Medical Mile in Grand Rapids.
I've shared the screen for the audience out there to get a flavor of how they bypass this concept that they call karmic return or spiritual return by putting it in our face, technically telling us something without telling us. And we clearly have genomic structuring, engineering, bioengineering studies going on, and then an ode to the digitized format of the same at the very end of this short frame shutter that they have for the home page. I just find it very fascinating, the connection to Dr. Collins and potentially even the development planning for the COVID-19 depopulation agenda. I think a lot of people out there are familiar with entities like the WEF or the WHO or UNC Chapel Hill or EcoHealth Alliance. There's been a tremendous amount of citizen journalism and even on up to certain governmental pulpits within the United States and within the Western world, and a tremendous amount of connectivity has certainly been fleshed out and brought out for people to see the overarching spider web for what it is. But not many individuals out there think of corporations like Toyota or Amway or others, or Nvidia, things like this, which are other, extremely involved corporate extensions of that same worldwide occultist depopulationist agenda being headed primarily by the United Nations. And I want to segue a little bit, if I could, Mr. Ayers, on that particular topic, the United Nations and that globalist agenda. You've said a couple of times that Amway is categorically serving the United Nations. And they also have operations, as many patriots out there will be aware of, a company that size. They have operations really all over the world, with a tremendous amount of operation happening, or has been happening, excuse me, over the last 2 years within the Ukraine and on behalf of so-called Ukrainian interests. As a matter of fact, according to a press release in March of 2022, as a result of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, Amway shuttered their business model within Russia's borders and shifted that support primarily to the Ukrainian side, and has even assisted in the exfiltration of Ukrainian officials out of the country, along with Ukrainian Amway business owners as well. So that being said, this is very close proximity to what is currently a geopolitical event reshaping the entirety of Western and Eastern Europe potentially forever. We're sort of tiptoeing the line between essentially assisting in a warfare effort, and this can't be, I think, strategically in the interests of not only Amway but any privately or so-called privately owned organization. So, do you care to highlight for us what exactly, from your experience as an inside business owner and understanding, or an independent business owner, excuse me, and understanding how that model has worked against we the people for so long? What is happening here with regards to Amway's involvement in very large geopolitical maneuvers?
Yeah, I think as you look at that, nations and other nations that are a part of things. Matter of fact, Justin Trudeau, right before COVID happened, he brought in all the Amway diamonds from China into Toronto, Canada. This was another topic that raised a red flag for myself as to, well, what were they coordinating? What is the reason that they bring in all the Chinese diamonds and not the US American diamonds to be able to communicate with Canadians if they were interested in growing the North American business? Um, there was an agenda here, obviously, that we're looking at to, obviously, as they rolled out COVID, to be able to get rid of the American government. Not necessarily the American government, but the American military. And as we look into the jabs, we look into the focus of what they're doing to take apart the backbone. It's very interesting to see that. China, for example, is Amway's largest group of business today. The multiple different people over there back in the 70s and 80s, they weren't even allowed into the country per se. But as they were persistent, the Van Andels actually broke open the business to, say, the Chinese market. Well, if you look at the business today in North America, the structure of the communist business in China for Amway is run through a communist perspective. It's a socialist form of business over there. Guess what they're doing? They're implementing the communist form of Amway in the United States with the Amway business owners. But what they're doing is they're boiling a frog. They're implementing very slowly so the current business owners who understand freedom don't blow the whistle and say, hey. So slowly but surely, they're creating regulations to track, monitor every single transaction that happens. So that way they don't understand that, hey, it is a communist business today. So those are the things I've noticed that they're implementing the Canadian, the Chinese form of business here in North America. And so those are rules. And you start looking into the United Nations rules on commerce. Every transaction must be transactionally commerce through a cell phone. There will be no business or sale. That even looks into almost as if the mark of the beast. There will be no transactions, no buying and selling without the number. And so you even look into this, even the data of the mRNA and those things that are put into people. This is where we skate that fine line of conspiracy theory to now conspiracy realists. What is being tracked and why? What really happened in, say, China to a population of, say, 10 to 20 million people? Where did these people go? Where did their cell phones go? It's very unique. It's very interesting to look at that whole 5G rollout, which is just an interesting topic to say the least. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening worldwide. But once you have control over there, they are now expanding into other countries, and people don't know their pure intent. They're hiding as conservatives, they're hiding as American business, and it is a royal shock when you actually learn the truth of what's actually happening.
Truer words never spoken on this great awakening journey. You know, Mr. Ayers, as we move into our closing segment, I just have to say I really appreciate you bringing the information to the audience out there. Again, this is one of those topics that I think, is not probably heavy on the lips of many patriots unless they have a personal stake in it or a personal interest in understanding, the progression of this topic. But as far as that progression and looking forward into this process, we're now in the post-COVID landscape. We're in a world that seems to be moving increasingly towards decentralization. What are some of the steps or things that patriots can do or be aware of, both with your personal journey for justice with, Amway Corporation, but also from a more broad view worldwide? What are those things that patriots really need to be looking for and can be involved in over these next few months and years?
Well, as we really look at this, we're looking at the next 5 months and what's happening in front of us. We're actually looking at a country that's trying to redefine itself in terms of reclaiming its republic, reclaiming its constitution. And so, as we look at these things that are before us, and that is calling out what we call globalists. These are people that have an agenda, which goes back to the Bilderberg groups, which goes back to all these topics that people are really uneducated on. And so, as we look at the World Economic Forum and their goals, anything that aligns with those topics of control, tyranny, people need to speak up. You need to ask questions. You need to hold people accountable to the things that they say they are for. And if they don't align with freedom, then you need to stand up. You need to be the person who's willing to make that mark and declare your voice. And so I think that's the biggest thing is just calling out the elephant in the room and realizing that maybe it's a rhino in the room. And how do you identify those things? You look into their policies, you look into what they say, but then you actually watch what they actually do. And so that's the topic is understanding what people actually do. John McCain, a lot of people say that he died. Um, I won't even call his name. We'll leave him as no name. But he was with another gentleman by the name of Lindsey Graham in the Ukraine years before all this stuff happened. We're looking at election fraud in a perspective that today people got to understand that these voting machines have been controlled within the say we'll call it the Bush dynasty for a long period of time. Even before that, as we go back to the Kennedy time frame and when the military industrial complex took over, what can we really do? I've had so many people go, "Oh, why are you even talking about this? There's nothing you can do." Bet me. And you know what? There's a lot of other people just like me that once they hear and they know the truth, they're willing to stand up too. It's this education to just know what's behind the curtain a little bit. And once you start to realize that these are things that are working against not only our country, but your children, against your family, against your neighbor, it is your civic duty to go out there and tell people the truth and really to educate them a little bit so they understand when the next go around comes. Because guess what? 1917, right? They came out with a pandemic. Well, what do you know? In the 1970s, they came out with a pandemic. A lot of people didn't realize it, but in the 2000s, they came out with a pandemic. Didn't necessarily fly. There is a resistance. We'll call them white hats. We'll call them whatever they are. We'll call them good people that are standing in the way. Guess what? In the Trump election last time, there was a pandemic. And you know what? If we look behind, we're starting to realize who these bad characters are. These are the people that we need to illuminate. We need to put them in the spotlight. We need to tell people. So, you know what? That's what happens when people become educated, they become empowered. And I think that's really what it is. We need to empower other people to realize, you know what? The biggest part of things is when the people have a voice. And you know what? The biggest power that we have in the world is public opinion. Public opinion is bigger than any Congress. You know what? The people every time have stood up. Anytime we've had an issue where there's time to come is when the people have stood up. Their power that they try to have over us is to create a civil discord or a civil war. And guess what? It's repeatable. Every time we see history, that's what they've tried to do. And they tried it and they failed. They've been trying it again and they failed. Well, guess what? In the coming months, they may try it again. And I believe they're going to fail because people like you are educating people all over the planet and people are starting to stand up. And we can smell BS from a mile away. And that's what it is. We just need to be cool, calm, collect, and walk things out.
When we empower others, we step into our power ourselves. Judah, it has been a phenomenal conversation. I thank you so much for bringing this information to my audience. And for the folks out there, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I'll be back with each of you again soon on the Q News Patriot. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.